Alrighty, so this is your study guide, exam one review. So for Intro to Crim, chapter two, pre-classical perspectives of crime and punishment, what I'm talking about there is the fact that, for most of civilization, people thought that crime was caused by some sort of supernatural force or, something spiritual happening. Um, so that was basically what they thought caused a crime, right? That you could get the demon out of someone, or that someone was possessed, or something of that nature. When it came to punishment and Beccaria, he was talking about how, crimes should be punished for what they are, meaning that regardless of the context or circumstance, that, if you commit a crime, you do the time, kind of thing. Um, as far as the death penalty, he did not think it was effective because he thought of, well, for a few reasons, right? It talks about how if you are to buy into society's goals and views, that's the social contract, right? You have to get something back from society. So he said that capital punishment violated the social contract because it also provided a negative example to the rest of society that you solve things through murder. And in all honesty, it wasn't because he was such a humanitarian. It was because he thought that the death penalty was too quick to be an effective punishment. Let's see. Three key elements of punishment are, we talked about these before. The celerity, right, which is the swiftness of punishment. The certainty of punishment, which he thought was the most important, right? And the severity, like how long a sentence will be. So those are the three key elements of punishment. Specific versus general. Specific is the deterrence that focuses primarily on the individual. So an example would be like, you go to court and you get charged with a certain, period of time in jail. And general deterrence is the deterrence that other people experience because of the punishment on the individual. So, if you basically see that a certain person commits a crime and gets a period of time in jail, right? That may or may not deter you in the future, right? So something like Brock Turner, the fact that he only got 3 months in jail for sexual assault, doesn't really serve as a deterrent versus if someone gets like 20 years in jail for sexual assault. Other people that might be considering those kind of crimes would see that and go, oh, I don't want to get 20 years in jail. 3 months, not a great deterrent. So anyway, let's see, difference between classical school and neoclassical school is just basically considering the context of the individual or the situation that a person was in, that you could either basically increase or decrease the punishment based on like if someone is mentally ill, you would decrease the punishment. If someone was killing in an act of revenge and a premeditated murder, you would make the consequence more, right? Those kind of things. Alrighty, chapter 3. All right, so rational choice theory. What I want you to know there is just the idea that they emphasize important factors that go into a decision to engage in or not engage in a particular crime. As far as the most important findings of rational choice theory, that was just the idea that the expected benefits, particularly the pleasure that someone would get from offending, was one of the most significant effects on their decision to offend. And let's see, 3 factors of routine activities. You have the motivated offender, right? The part that they don't really describe at all. They don't really explain what that means. The suitable targets, right? Things that aren't that have a lack of guardianship. So it's really those 3: the motivated offender, suitable targets, lack of guardianship, that are the 3 factors in whether or not a crime happens. If those 3 factors are high within a specific geographic area where you see a lot of the convergence of those 3, that is referred to as a hot spot. So that's what hot spots are. Lifestyles perspective basically argues that, what choices an individual makes in how they live their life will affect whether or not they become a victim, right? Like in the book, they give that example of, young people are more likely to get to be the victims of violence in the evening because they're more likely to be out in public versus the elderly are much less likely because they're much more likely to be at home, right? So that kind of the idea of your specific lifestyle, what choices you're making affect whether or not you're a perpetrator or victim. And then the broken windows one, there's a video about that, kind of talking about how when you put these theories into practice, they tried this, and broken windows policing basically emphasized the need to crack down on minor offenses, right? Like vandalizing, jaywalking, literally broken windows, like just dilapidation of buildings. Because the thought was if you focus on those minor offenses, those will reduce more major crimes in the future. And there's a video about that. I suggest watch on that PowerPoint to refresh your memory. All right, chapter 4. Eugenics, all I'm going to talk about there is the fact that, in California ourselves, we did so much of the research and stuff on eugenics, kind of promoting this idea that some groups are biologically inferior or superior, right? And that, that logic and actually the actual research design done in the California experiment was what was used as the basis of, Hitler's extermination efforts. Alrighty, let's see, next up. Oh, craniometry. So that is the belief that the size of the brain or the skull represents the superiority or inferiority of individuals based on ethnic or racial groups. So again, coming out of the era of eugenics, this idea that you could basically look at the size of a person's brain and say they're superior or inferior. And of course, they decided that the shape that was normative of a European skull was superior for some reason, because they were. Let's see, phrenology is the science of determining someone's disposition based on their skull. So again, they thought very similar to craniometry that your skull corresponds to the exact shape of your brain, right? So if you have like a bump or a weird thing on your head, that there's a problem with your brain in that same spot. So that's phrenology. Physiognomy is the study of facial and other bodily aspects in order to indicate developmental problems, such as criminality. So basically, it's just kind of taking phrenology and then also adding in like limbs and appendages. Let's see. Lombros's theory of atavism is the arguments that criminals are like a throwback to an earlier stage of human evolution. So that in evolution, they're like the missing link or that kind of a thing, right? That their physical makeup, intelligence, and instincts are that of primitive man. So that's his theory of atavism. Let's see here. Okay, yeah, stigmata are, well, basically, Lombroso kind of changed what he thought stigmata was. So he wasn't too consistent about it, but what he did stay consistent about was that it was facial or bodily features that deviated from the norm. Alrighty, so Sheldon's model of somatyping basically said that there's 3 different kind of body types, and the endomorph, the ectomorph, and the mesomorph, and that depending on a person's body type, you could predict whether or not they were going to commit crimes. So he said, that the endomorph is a body type of someone that is obese. The ectomorph is a body type of someone that's very thin. And a mesomorph is the body type of someone that is muscular and athletic. And, his theory kind of goes back to the same eugenics kind of crap, where he's saying that, the people that are mesomorphs are more likely to commit crime because he also kind of saw them as slightly evolutionary throwbacks, but because, they're more likely to be aggressive or take risks, and that could lead to more crimes. All right, when it comes to the code of the street, the introduction, let's see. Sociological imagination is just the ability to see the larger picture, where you can combine an individual's biography with the larger social forces that shape their experience and opportunities. Violence is a feature of urban life. All I'm looking for there is just the fact that, when people are living in this neighborhood, whether they are decent or street, they have to deal with the violence, right? They have to deal with it being a feature of their everyday life, whether or not they're a part of it or benefit from it. The existence of racialized violence, the fact that he talks about how all the crimes that are happening in like the Chestnut Hill or like the wealthier areas up the block um, are typically done by young African American men, and so what that does is kind of make this perception within the community that that if you see a young African American man, that he's at risk for committing crimes. Basically, that you assume criminality on young African American men, and so that's kind of where the racialized issue comes in. Feminization of poverty just means that more women live in poverty than men due to social factors like pay inequity, where men make more than women. And all these other social factors like the cost of childcare and stuff like that mean that women end up more likely to live in poverty. Okay, so this idea of what does it mean that inclination to violence is a result of life circumstances? So just meaning that people don't really have good opportunities. There's not public services. They don't have good paying jobs. You see the violence and the problems on the street because of, the drug trade. Um, this creates this kind of alienation in the community. So it means that people kind of result like because of their life circumstances, they end up using violence as a way to get respect. As far as respect itself, um, it's considered the heart of the code, but really, he talks about in the chapter how it's not something that's easily given. It's something that's hard won, and it has to be negotiated. So it's important to avoid altercations because through those altercations, you could end up being, pushed down the hierarchical ladder. So, um, it's important to be able to use violence in order to protect your reputation so that you have enough respect. Okay, chapter one. Let's see. So how social learning theory relates? Well, because basically people are seeing people behave in illegal ways because of the drug trade being so visible on the street that normalizes that behavior, right? And, you know, also at the same time, kids are growing up in homes where, you know, some alternative values are being taught, like not to respect the police, not to respect authority figures, those kind of things. So they don't learn those values, right? That's kind of how social learning theory relates, especially to those street kids, right? The decent learn both, really. The decent learn the world of the street through interaction and living it, but the decent are socialized with the value system of mainstream society. All right, decent and street. So there's this idea that they're two polar opposite categories, but in reality, it's much more fluid because sometimes people themselves are decent or street, right? Like sometimes people like violate that boundary. Also, most families have like some decent, some street, meaning that there's kind of that overlap. And the people in the neighborhood, you know, categorize themselves and others with those labels, but they're not really polar opposites. Let's see, street-oriented casualties. Oh, that's kind of the answer. Just basically kind of going back to what I was talking about before, the idea that, you know, residents face a lot of hardships because of the social and economic issues that they're dealing with. So, you know, not having a decent education, and that's not going to give you a great outlook on the future or where you're going to like value education or those kind of things. You know, there's a real contempt for police and the criminal justice system because it's seen as operating very unfairly and harshly from like a, you know, outsider perspective. And there's this distinct thug life culture that rejects mainstream middle class white society and sees it as kind of like the enemy. So, you know, this idea that when you're rejected, you're not going to necessarily buy into the larger culture that doesn't value you or automatically assumes that you're bad. So that's kind of how that develops. Let's see. Decent families' role of man of the house. You know, there's this patriarchal role of like male dominance connected to this man of the house, you know, archetype. It reflects those general expectations that women and children are supposed to be passive to this dominant male. Um, but at the same time, It also reflects the gender role expectations that men have to be strong, they had to be the financial provider, and part of that means that they're going to have to physically protect the family if there's any altercations. So that's a very dangerous role to be in a neighborhood that has such a prevalence of violence, because the likelihood that they are going to have to face some sort of violence is very high. When it comes to street-oriented women and parenting, they are parenting their children very sporadically. So, like, they're there, they're not there. Often, if women are facing drug addiction themselves, they're not going to really be around or engaged. So, the kids end up learning that they have to fight for a place in the world, and oftentimes they're, kind of growing up without supervision, which makes them grow up really fast. Um, Social norms are just expectations for how you're supposed to live in a specific situation. Let's see. Okay, chapter 2, social capital. So that's just the idea that if you have certain social groups, those will bring you rewards in society, right? So we talked about it in relation to if you're a first generation college student or not. Like, if you are first generation, you don't have the same social capital as people who had people that could help them get into college. So it's kind of this idea, if you know the right people, you can get into the right groups, right? It's the whole point of networking and all that crap. So, in relation to the code of the street, obviously, the what gives you the social rewards is having a social group that is feared and respected, right? One that is seen to commit violence, right? That's going to give you the most credibility, the most power. Okay, so the street can overwhelm decent socialization. All that means is that, it's because it's such a lure, the street often overwhelms decent socialization. Even if a kid has grown up their whole lives hearing, like, work hard, do this, do that, save for the future, blah, blah, blah. But then they see their friends that are street oriented, they grow up in the same neighborhood. They see these kids getting all the stuff that they want, right? And also just being an economic need. It's a driving force, right? It can kind of sway people that otherwise would want to follow the laws and be an upstanding citizen to do things like engage in drug trade that they wouldn't otherwise do because they financially need something to support them, right? So, it can be a lure because of the money, and it could be a lure because of the power and the status it can give specifically men, for being in that hierarchy of the trade. Let's see. Juice is just a person's share of respect in the street. So you have to fight to increase your reputation, basically. And so, otherwise people are going to challenge you. So, if juice is the vernacular used in this particular community, explaining how, basically if you don't want to get challenged by other people, you're going to have to be able to fight well and maintain that respect. Campaigning is just when you're trying to, um, you know, boost your own status, often through putting other people down or taking other people's stuff, right? So part of this is like presenting yourself out in public with like a lot of stuff on. I think I, I used in class, I used the analogy from the film Friday. I know, not the best analogy, but the idea of like someone rolls onto the block and all of a sudden everyone's hiding their jewelry because they know this guy is going to come up and try and challenge them and take their stuff. This idea, that's kind of what campaigning is that, you want to, once you're formally challenged and kind of challenge back, you can't back down. So a lot of people end up getting in violent fights or, risk death over stupid things like stupid material possessions or, territorial disputes of blocks and things like that. So, campaigning is really like you bring yourself up by putting others down. And the bystander effect is the fact that most people don't really, involve themselves if there's something violent going on because they think someone else will do it, right? Especially the more people that are there, the less people that will intervene. So oftentimes, a lot of people in the neighborhood are seeing these horrible things of violence happening, but no one's calling the cops, no one's intervening. And of course, the fact that the community doesn't necessarily trust the police, and those things are bigger problems. But also the fact that just as in general, as humans, we tend to kind of like take away our individual responsibility depending on how many more people are there that could do something. All right, last part, chapter 8. Okay, park and the principles of ecological principles in city growth. Basically, he was just saying that the city itself becomes a complex organism that has a sense of unity that comes from the fact that citizens depend upon each other. So different groups of citizens form, this larger ecosystem that has this kind of symbiosis. And that, he said that within these cities, there would be identifiable clusters he calls natural areas, or what we would call like ethnic enclaves. And that, some areas are going to invade others, and that the previous areas die off, just like how species can invade, um, you know, from one area and take over another. And so, which, nowadays they see that in the what's called urban sprawl, right? In the way that city growth happens. Concentric circles. The theory of concentric circles is really just the argument that each inner zone in a city puts pressure on the next zone to grow, and that it just kind of expands outward from the center, right? Social disorganization theory, just arguing that, well, first they start with the assumption that certain neighborhoods have more crime than other parts of the city, and that the neighborhoods that have the highest rate of crime have three things in common: physical dilapidation, poverty, and heterogeneity, which means like a cultural mix of people. And argued that neighborhoods that have a high confluence of factors lead to a state of social disorganization, which leads to crime and delinquency. Culture and subculture. Basically, they were just saying that there's certain groups in society, like these unique subcultures, that will socialize their kids to believe that certain things that violate the law are good and positive ways to behave, right? Just kind of like something we'll talk about through social learning later on. Alrighty, so that is that. Okay, short answer essay questions. So remember, what I was talking about there was make sure you answer both parts of the question. So first one, what is the code of the street? So define it, explain it. Why is it important that decent and street community members know and live by it, right? Focusing there on the violence, the prevalence of violence in everyday life, and what could be the consequence if you don't know it. Okay, number two, what is the difference between specific and general deterrence? Actually talked about that earlier in this lecture, right? The idea that specific is the actual sentence applied to an individual, and general is, what everyone sees, like other people's responses to that sentence. So I want you to just give examples of that, right? I want you to kind of clearly define what specific is, give an example, what general is, give an example, and explain to me which is more effective, right? From your perspective, and why. So not just, I think that, specific is more effective. Okay, well, why? Right? So that's what I'm going to be looking for there. And yeah, that is your study guide exam review. Hope this helps, and yep.